The Jimmy Olsen Radio Network.
Spinal adjustments provided by Dr. Chad Rolfson. The Spinal Tuning Chiropractic Center is a Des Moines area low flat fee per month unlimited chiropractic care practice. When life happens, just adjust. Schedule today at spinaltuning.com. Welcome to the Daily Planet. I am Jimmy Olsen, and joining me today, I don't really know the right way of saying this because I want to be fun with it, but if I am too fun with it, then, I might get chastised by many people. So I guess we're just going to go out. I have another father with me today. I mean, a few weeks ago, I'm sure you saw my conversation or heard my conversation with Father John Ricardo. I have Father PJ McManus, who is the pastor of Christ the King Church in Des Moines, but he's also co-host of Be Not Afraid, which is on Iowa Catholic Radio, and you can also hear the podcast pretty much anywhere that you listen to your favorite podcast. Father PJ, how are you?
I'm well, Jimmy. How are you?
You know what? That's a dangerous question today, but we're going to go with good. We're going to go with good.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it was an interesting day, and I'm not going to bore people with all those. Maybe that could be another podcast altogether that we can have conversations about. How do you deal with this?
Right. Unwanted phone calls. How about that?
Yeah, we'll go with that. Again, always, and you know what? And I guess let's get that out there. When someone calls you on the phone, and we hear about this a lot, especially right now with the stimulus checks that are coming out. You've heard about it when it comes to, credit card information, when it comes to, Medicare, whatever it is. When they call you, it is most likely false because they do not call. They either send you something in the mail, most likely, or you might get an email, but that's still kind of iffy. But basically, if somebody calls you and asks you for information, do not provide it. Period. There's your public service announcement from the Daily Planet and Jimmy Olsen and Father PJ. So, all right. So Father, here's the conversation I'm kind of like leaning towards. And we've been chatting about this for a while. And I mean, I even talked about it I talked about it with Father Ricardo, the idea that I had, and he goes, that's just a wild idea. So you're Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
I am not.
Mm-hmm.
And and of course, growing up Catholic, I'm sure, and then even growing up Pentecostal charismatic, there's always the stories that you hear about how, well, if they don't go to this church or if they're not in this denomination, they're going to hell. They're wrong. Everything they do is incorrect. That's what's pretty much beat in your head growing up. At least it was for me. So Everyone was wrong, no matter what. And then we get older. Hopefully you get wiser. And then you start asking questions. And you start learning different things that go, well, wait a minute. This isn't as whacked out as it is. And it's not just the religion thing, because right now when you look at here in America and what's happening in the government, which is just a complete fiasco, but it still comes down to, and I remember this class in college that was ask the right questions. Are you asking the right question? And I find that, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I find that really is the problem. People are not asking the right questions, or at least not listening if they're asking.
Yeah, probably both, right? So people certainly fail to ask the right questions. I think a lot of it has to do with the way that we teach children any longer.
Mm-hmm.
Children are taught from very early on, like the goal of school is to just get the right answer.
Right.
And so this filters itself out into every sort of facet of life and living, right? So there is a right answer for the right kind of diet, a right answer for the right kind of exercise, a right answer for the right kind of church. And it would seem that human life doesn't always work like that.
Mm-hmm.
and that there are more kind of variables that attach to that. And that, life and experience tells us that very often the best learning, the most important lessons that we learn come from a failure or mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I got the wrong answer first, but without getting the wrong answer here, I could never have arrived at the place that I think is now actually the right answer, right? And so it's not simply about sort of this or that. Accuracy is important. So the thing you're talking about with especially as we describe other people,
mm-hmm.
right? So, oh, well, they're all going to hell because And then when you finally talk to them, they're like, no, we don't do or think that at all. That's just a weird, somebody from the outside thought that, right?
Right.
And so that's fair enough. I'm not saying like there's nothing that's true, right? But that most things in life are not quite as this or that as we're often led to believe as small children.
Well, I mean, a lot of times there's a little more gray. It's not that straight black and white like they try to separate it. Mm-hmm. Just because there's a lot of things that are agreed upon, but maybe in a different way of agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Does that, I mean,
excellent.
Does that make really make sense? So here's the idea. So you actually, PJ and I, Father PJ and I, we work together. Those of you that know I do this, and I work at the Catholic radio station, and I'm not Catholic. And of course, now someone's going to listen that goes, and he's like, he's not. Oh my gosh. Well, anyway, we won't go down that road at this point. I might have to here in a couple weeks, but that's a different story altogether there. But I mean, I'm going on my third year. So, I've been there a couple years, and there's been a lot of fantastic conversations that I've had. And one of the things that always gets brought up is telling me how I do not know the truth, or and it comes down to the sacraments. I do not know all of the sacraments. You do not, literally, and this was said to me, you do not believe all the sacraments. And this happened a while ago. And I know I've already told you the story, but I'll share it with those listening.
Sure.
I'm going, so, okay, what are these sacraments? So I work with a deacon, and I asked him, and I even went to our general manager, and I asked him, and we kind of went through, and they walked through the sacraments, and which we'll do that here in a moment. And I'll go, well, check. The 7 sacraments, I believe in all 7 of them. Now, do we believe in them the same? We have different definitions, which is what we're going to get into today. But I think it really comes down to have a conversation with other people, listen to what they have to say, and don't come up with a assumption about them before you know. Because I have many friends, and I do not take either side when it comes to politics. As a friend of mine describes me, I am an equal opportunity offender on both sides, because they both irritate the fire out of me.
Mm-hmm.
But I have friends that are Republicans, and I have friends that are Democrats. In fact, some of my better friends are Democrats because we see so eye to eye on so many things.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of the idea. I think you and I have had the conversation before. There's the 2 things that we teach children. What was the meme that you were telling me that's been flying around Facebook lately or on social?
Right. It's a kind of a riff on a quote from Juliana Baggett, who has written. She's a novelist, but what she says is basically we've taught people from the dinner table not to talk about politics or religion, and then we wonder why as adults they're unable to talk intelligently about religion or politics.
Which is interesting, because really, if you think about it, and it doesn't matter what side of the fence you're on or what you believe, those are 2 very important topics,
right,
in a person's life. Both.
Yeah, it's really destructive. I mean, what's ironic about this, right, is that like in what would probably be thought of as much more religious societies, theocratic type societies, like in Saudi Arabia or something, you're much more likely to hear like dinner table conversation about this. But what's ironic about it is like not talking about those most important things is really destructive of democracy. Because the way the process is supposed to work is like by people arguing with each other, and they can't do that if they're not taught to have respectful, intelligent, both affirming and challenging discussions with each other. But many of us were taught, as very young children, don't talk about these things in polite company, or don't talk about them unless you're 100% certain that the people that you're with are going to agree with you, because conflict or discord or disagreement is like the great evil.
Or do not talk about something unless you know what you're talking. I just repeated that you know what you're talking about 100%, that you have the answer. And of course,
unless you're certain that you know.
Yeah, right. And I'll be honest, I talk about things that I have no clue anything about all the time, but I have that conversation because I'm willing to listen to find out. I want to know more. I was the nerdy child. This is back before there was a Discovery Channel or Smithsonian or anything. All of the documentaries were on HBO. And I happened to grow up in a home that we had cable. My dad had to have cable, so we had HBO. So I'm watching all these documentaries, either being on politics, religion, history. I mean, I'm an 8-year-old watching this stuff. I know, I'm a nerd. I get it. But it just really, I think, gets it to where you ask, it kind of really forms you to ask questions and find out how things work.
Mm-hmm.
So, but let's go ahead and start growing into the meat of these things. And is there a specific order I need to do these 1 through 7 to?
Well,
so
why
I
don't you
offend
list
anyone?
them, and then we can. I'll help you order them in a way that kind of makes sense. But before we do that, can I talk a little bit just about the word?
What word is that?
Sacrament.
Yes.
So
please.
so what Jimmy, from your sense, not of necessarily what Catholics would think, but like, what is your sense of the word sacrament? What is that meant to mean?
I mean, I guess that's interesting because it's a word that I never really grew up with.
Uh-huh.
But I think when it comes to the sacrament, it is something, it's part of that belief system that, what you believe. And it's like that bullet point piece when you're doing your outline. Sacraments is the headline, and then you bullet point or outline the sacraments then underneath that, which then creates your belief system, your philosophy, your ideals on, what you grew up in or what your beliefs are. How far off am I?
Not terribly. So the word sacrament is an English form of a Latin word, which is just sacramentum.
Mm-hmm.
But the Latin, of course, is a translation of Greek because the New Testament was written in Greek,
right?
Or at least mostly written in Greek.
This is why I love you, PJ, because of the history that you know. I eat this up like terribly. Anyway, sorry, go on.
That's all right. That's all right. So the word that's being translated into Latin as sacramentum, into English as sacrament, the word sacrament really is better translated as mystery.
Okay.
And that word mystery comes from, it's a compound in Greek. It's mu, which is where we get the word mute from.
Mm-hmm.
And then steres, which is like a happening or an event. So a mysterion, or a mystery, is an event before which we fall silent. The Greeks, prior to the coming of Christ, had what were called mystery religions. They were religions that were sort of ritually based.
Mm-hmm.
And these were often specified forms of sort of ordinary Greek paganism, but that were very, they were ritually focused, and the rituals were intended to sort of initiate the person, the practitioner, into some greater understanding of what the god or the gods were doing in their lives. So the Pythagorean school is the most famous of these sort of mystery things. Well, what happens is when the Old Testament first is translated into Greek, what we call the Septuagint, which is where the Catholics get their version of the Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
the word mysterion is used for the ceremonies that happen at the temple, right?
Sure.
So the sacrifices and the observances of the old law. And then in the New Testament, it only gets used once, which is very interesting, because St. Paul's the one who's writing it. So he knows the Septuagint. He knows the way that it gets used in the Greek Old Testament, but he only uses it in that chapter from Ephesians that people don't like anymore, because it begins right with wives be submissive to your husbands.
Oh,
so in Ephesians
man.
5,
yeah,
right? Yeah, you know where we're going. So,
right.
so what he does is, it's in Ephesians 5, and he's kind of riffing on marriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he says, "Wives, be submissive to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ has loved the church, he who laid himself down for her." And then he kind of does this dance back and forth for 5 or 6 verses, and then at the end of it, he says, "This is a mega mysterion, a great mystery, the mystery of Christ and his church." So one of the great ironies around the language of mystery or sacrament is that later on, when Protestants and Catholics have fights over which things count as sacraments and which ones don't,
Mm-hmm.
the Protestants at the time of the Reformation, Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, they're very insistent that marriage is definitely not a sacrament. We'll say why in a minute. But the irony is, the only time the word is used in the Bible is around marriage. It's not used around baptism or Eucharist or anything else. It's pointing to that relationship between men and women. And so So what happens is when the common language of the church in the West becomes Latin, a different word is chosen because the word mysterium, which is the Latin form of mysterion, has more than one meaning. So they feel like they need to specify it. So the word sacrament is chosen, and I say chosen rather than invented because it already existed.
Mm-hmm.
And the word sacramentum literally means, so the sacra is like where we get the word sacred from. It means literally to make holy or to set aside. And in its origin, a sacramentum was an oath that a soldier would take to his commanding officer in the Roman legion. And it was an oath that bound him sort of for life. It was much like a covenant in the Jewish sense, that bound your life to this other person. So those two words, mystery and sacrament, really in the tradition come to play up and against each other very, very much. And they have these kind of dual meanings, both of a thing that's so powerful that I can't help but have it take my breath away, and at the same time, a something which calls something out of me, that demands something of me, that demands my head and my heart, my will and my intellect to move towards something, to assent to something. And so the church winds up using these ultimately for these kind of key moments in the Christian life, maybe milestone moments or significant moments that mark important periods in the life of faith.
Which is interesting because, when you talk about sacraments, I've heard the sacrament of marriage over and over. I mean, I've heard that many times in many different ways. And that's probably where I've heard the word sacrament in my entire life. Most was when it was also always tied to marriage, even growing up. So that's where I would have heard that piece. So interesting.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and again, man, just in that conversation there, it also goes into the leading of different ways. So you grow up learning about mysteries. You're calling them mysteries. And mysteries are bad.
Right.
You don't say that. It's kind of like using even when you read through the Bible and they talk about the seers or of course, I have another one that is escaping my mind. It was another term that they use to call like the religious leaders and things like that.
Right.
But it's like you can't call them that because they're trying to use that. Like say, we'll stick with the seer one because that's the one that's popping in my head because that is tied to witchcraft or it's tied to something pagan, even though it's scriptural. That's what they were called.
Well, so even something like the Magi, the wise men from Epiphany, right? So that word Magi is where we get the word magician from. So they're not like Ethiopian Jewish holy men or something, right? They're pagan magicians, and in old English translations of the Bible, the oldest versions like of Wycliffe or the King James or the Douay Rheims for the Catholics. They're called magicians or sorcerers. They're actually called sorcerers. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who come to see the baby. Now, of course, later on in the Acts of the Apostles, Simon Magus, who's the same thing, he's a magician, is called that. And by that point, it's clearly a bad thing. Like we don't want anything to do with them, right?
Right.
But the words change over time. I think it's really important, both Catholics and Protestants, to kind of remember this piece, that much of the language that we receive today, 2,000 years later, was originally ordinary speech that became specialized later on. So you work with Deacon Tony at the radio station, and that word deacon, well, it has different connotations in different denominational traditions, always means somebody who does something at church. Like it's not, you don't use that as a random word for the janitor or something, right?
Right.
But in origin, right, a diakonos is literally like the butler. Mm-hmm. So Deacon Tony is just like Butler Tony,
right,
or Servant Tony, right? And so you can tell him that when you go to the radio station tomorrow.
I will, trust me. I'm going to say that to him.
And then likewise, presbyteros, the word for priest or elder, literally just means like older person, revered, respected person. That word
gets paired with another one which has sacrificial meaning, which is why Catholics and Orthodox Christians really insist on the word priest. But in origin, that's all that means. And the big one, right, is episkopos, bishop, like where we get Episcopalian from.
Mm-hmm.
Epi, like an EpiPen, means over, and skopos, like to scope out, means to look over. So an episkopos is really just a manager. He's an overseer, like at a job site. And so when you see Bishop Joneson, he's really just like he's like the head grunt on the line, is what his job is supposed to be.
Right. He's leading the rest, but he's still doing the same thing as you, basically. Did I lose you?
Jimmy?
Hey, there you are.
I am so sorry. We had technical difficulty there. A word that I said apparently tripped Alexa.
I guess. Well, everything I heard everything that you said up until that last second. So I think when you thought you lost me, but we were good, because it actually goes into the next question. Not a question, but it brings up something else, which again I'm sure very deep. Not for this particular episode, but I mean, like for me growing up, you had the pastor, but then you had the elder, and then you had the deacon. So it was like the level. So pastor, elder, then deacon, where, I mean, you're just talking about elder and priest. I mean, that's so, interesting. I mean, again.
Well, the main point there, I think, is less, it is important how different denominations wind up pairing this stuff out. But the more important, I think, thing is for us to all recognize that these words were originally common words.
Right.
That came to have specialized meaning. So when we say things like, the word deacon means servant, because the word deacon for us means like churchy person, we think, it's like the thing that happens in gift shops where you see your name on a card or something.
Sure.
My given name is Patrick. It says Patrick means noble or father. You think, oh, that's sweet. My name has a meaning. Right. No, it's not like that. Like patricius literally means father. Like it's the father of a household. It doesn't, like, it's not a name. It's just a word. And some guy didn't have a name. The Latins were especially bad at this. They were notorious for naming their kids like primus, secundus, and tertius. They would literally just name their kid first, second, and third.
Right. And you're one, you're two, and you're three.
Right. And so it sounds real sort of suave today or sophisticated. At the time, it was the most basic thing it could be.
So basically what you're saying is parents should be naming their kids thing one, thing two.
Thing two.
We just need to go full Dr. Seuss on this.
Dr. Seuss on it. You got it.
Of course, you see the meaning of my name, which is actually James, even though I use Jimmy in radio, but I'm a liar. So, talk to my exes about that one. So as we get into the sacraments,
sorry,
you're fine. No, you are just fine. Hey, it's all fun and games until the truth comes out. So we're going to go with the. So again, the biggest conversation, I guess, like I said, we've been chatting about this for a while, and it was going through the sacraments, just because I'm being told I am so wrong and I don't believe, and then that's where my automatic response is, what do I not believe? Tell me what I don't know. Tell me what I'm not believing. And of course, 9 times out of 10, you ask that question, and they, of course, can't say because they don't know. But so the sacraments are, so we'll go ahead and just run through them and start going them. So those are the 7 sacraments. We've got baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, penance, anointing the sick, marriage, and holy orders. And is that the order that, so for me to do this right for you, is that the correct order for them?
They're paired properly. The order is not really important, except maybe the first 3. But it's that the sacraments have a relationship to each other.
Sure.
And because of their relationship to each other, they're kind of paired together. But I think the very first thing, like, so we've established, right, that this word sacrament or mystery originally had a common meaning and then came to have a more specialized meaning.
Sure.
Now, today in the Catholic Church and in general in the Orthodox churches and in the Anglican tradition, it's going to mean these 7 things.
Okay.
But that didn't happen like all at once. Like somebody didn't just flip a switch and then say, this is now what this word means. That happened over a period of time. so that the fathers, and really as late as the 9th, 10th century, the word sacrament was fluid enough that it's not like it meant any old thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there were other things that would be attached to a list like this. So Hugh of St. Victor, who's a very famous medieval theologian, right? He names 30 sacraments. And he includes things like the funeral, not that it's a sacrament for the dead person, but for those that are left alive.
Okay.
The consecration of a church, the blessing of an abbot or an abbess, which is not normally considered part of our thing. One big one in the Middle Ages was the coronation of a king or a queen. That was definitely understood to be a sacrament until very late, to the point where if you go back and watch the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, what we think of as her coronation robes, they're just deacon vestments. She's vested as a deacon at her coronation.
Oh,
because
wow.
it's a kind of a memory of
Mm-hmm.
the king or the queen is the servant of the whole country, right?
Sure.
And so they're vested in servant's clothes, the clothes of the deacon. And so the word sort of morphs over time to mean like ritually or churchy things that have significant meaning. And then it becomes more specialized by about the 12th century, where there's these 7 sort of super special ones that the church really wants to land on and say, these are significant in a very particular way, and they're necessary, if not to the life of the individual, to the life of the church, right? They're part of what makes a church a church.
Okay.
And so like, most priests in the West are celibate, so they're not married. So it's not like each person receives all 7, but in the church, you need to have people that both receive the sacrament of orders, priesthood,
Mm-hmm.
and also other people who receive the sacrament of marriage. If you only had people who receive the sacrament of marriage, you wouldn't have ministers to administer the sacraments. If you only had people who receive the sacrament of orders, you wouldn't have anybody having babies to receive the sacraments.
Sure.
Right? And so it's not that very few people in life go through and receive all 7 sacraments, but the church celebrates all 7 sacraments, and it's a sign of the life and vitality of the local church more than the individual.
Right. So and you were saying that the priests of the West stay single. They
Mostly
do not
celibate,
get married.
right?
Celibate. But so what about the priests of, we'll say, the East?
The
'Cause
East.
You said West.
That's exactly right. Yep.
So does that mean the Eastern priests get married? Or
Eastern
can?
Catholic priests, Eastern Catholic priests, and Eastern Orthodox priests are mostly married. But the tradition, and this goes very, very far back and is universally held between the Catholic and the Orthodox churches, we don't allow ordained men to marry.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, we ordain already married men, whether that's as deacons or as priests.
Sure.
And so, and the idea there is you want to make sure that the guy is stabilized in the relationship that he's going to have that sort of defines his life,
Mm-hmm.
before you entrust him with the office of pastoring. In the West, because of the unique role that celibacy has, that would be a whole separate other podcast, but
Sure.
because of the unique role that celibacy has, more of us, the bulk of us, are ordained to the priesthood as unmarried men, and so we remain unmarried. But there are exceptions. The parish I was at before I came to my present assignment was a community of ex-Anglicans, and so the priest there at the time was married. So I'm one of the few regular Catholic priests that has served under a married priest. We do have a married priest here in Des Moines, Father Livingston, who was an Anglican priest before he converted to Catholicism, and so there are exceptions to it. But for the most part, Western priests are unmarried, and Eastern priests are married. But Easterners do have unmarried priests. They're mostly monks. And they take their bishops only from amongst the unmarried, either from the monks or from widowers, with the idea that the bishop needs to be so wholly dedicated to the life of the church that he needs to not presently have a wife or kids that he's responsible for because of the demands on his attention.
Right. The attention, the time, and things like that. Nothing else that's fighting for that. So out of all that, talk about the build up to the actual conversation.
Sorry.
No, lots of great information. There's no reason to apologize at all. I'm just, letting everyone know this is now the time. So we're going to go through these, and we're going to start with baptism, because baptism, depending on your belief, is a little different. Because so like with Catholics, baptism comes in when you are a baby. Where for me, it is something that happens a little more later. So let's look at the baptism one first. So on the Catholics believe baptism is go.
So baptism is the primal sacrament, both in the sense that it's first, so like primary, but also in that it's what enables the rest of this to happen.
Sure.
So from the Catholic perspective, Orthodox Christians would hold the same thing. A lot of liturgical Protestants, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Presbyterians, right, Methodists would say the same kind of thing here. The rest of the sacraments can't do what they're supposed to do if you're not already united to Christ and the church through baptism. Right. So baptism comes at the beginning, whether that is the beginning of your biological life as a baby or your life of faith as an adult. And it's what initially and uniquely conforms you to Christ. It in our traditional language, we would say it forgives sins, all sins, both personal sin and our notion of original sin, or the sin that's sort of inherited from our parents. It gives grace, it confers grace, and this is what comes to really define sacraments in the Catholic tradition. Is it's an outward sign of an interior grace, and it regenerates or renews or gives new life to the person in Christ, which makes them an adopted son or daughter of God. And so the church in its language, the church in its practice, we draw a pretty hard line in important ways between baptized persons and unbaptized persons, or between what we would understand as Christians and non-Christians. But we're much, if you will, softer between other Christians, so Protestants or Orthodox and Catholics, than we would be between Christians and non-Christians.
Sure.
And so that language of brother and sister really does get reserved to other Christians, not because we don't think we share a common humanity with Jews or Muslims or pagans or whatever, but because the sonship that we have in God comes to us from our relationship with Christ. And for us, that really is tied sort of essentially to baptism.
So for Catholics, baptism comes when the child is born.
So
basically, it's within like a few weeks after, the birth of a child.
Right. If a child's born into a Catholic family, then the expectation is that the parent have the child baptized within the first few weeks after birth.
Sure.
For most of our history, that's really been literally the Sunday after birth. So the reason godparents are such a big thing in the Catholic tradition, and the reason today this is especially clear, like with Latino communities like the one that I serve, the padrinos or the godparents are a big deal, is because for most of the church's history, mothers were not present at their baby's baptism. And that's because the baby was typically baptized the Sunday after birth, or maybe the second Sunday if the kid was born on like a Friday or a Saturday. But the mother was typically still on bed rest. And so that's not the way we do things now. But for more of our history, that was real common, was that women would stay confined for about a month after the baby was born. And so as a result, the godmother was called that because she was the woman who kind of acted in the mommy role at the baptism. She would cuddle and coo the baby so that it would be quiet, except for the moment when it was actually getting water poured on it. And then she would be the one who kind of comfort the baby when it was freaked out because mom wasn't around. And in a lot of places, frankly, the godmothers were also wet nurses. So if they needed to, they'd feed the kid, right? Because the kid would be out of sorts. And so godparents originally have an important role, not because they're the ones who take your kid if you happen to die or something, which is the way it kind of gets handed down now. That's the whole kind of the godfather thing.
Right.
It's more it's more because of their role in baptism. They're the ones that stand in the place of the mother or the father at the moment the child is baptized.
So in the comparison piece, so again, so with Catholicism, the baptism comes when the child, comes after birth. The child is born. So for me, it is dedication. So
Right.
I grew up with dedication. So they dedicated the child. So for you, for Catholics, what it is when you have that baptizing, it's not like you're like dumping the baby in a big, pail of water, but it's either you're sprinkling them or you are, pouring water over their head, depending on the belief, for the denomination that you are in. Or, I mean, like for us, it's the dedication of the child, dedicating your child to God, that you're going to raise him or her, under the hand of God, but then we anoint their head with oil. So you have
Right.
the anointed of oil with that dedication when we bring them in. So that's, again, we believe the same, just kind of in a different way or different words.
So what you're pointing to with this, Jimmy, which is really important, and both Catholics and Protestants could do to remember this or to relearn it or whatever, right, is that, again, these words have meanings originally that become specialized. So the word baptism really does originally mean like bath or immersion.
Sure.
And so the question of the method becomes very important later when there are other arguments going on between the Catholic and Protestant communities. But the method piece is in some ways far less important for us. And the sprinkling thing, frankly, is extraordinarily rare. I've never seen a baby sprinkled. I've never seen a person sprinkled for baptism in my entire life.
I have, but usually it was with a squirt gun, but that's a completely different story.
It's a different thing.
Right.
Exactly.
The super soaker 5,000.
But no, the question was at one point whether the person had to have their whole body submerged or just part of their body,
Sure.
their head or not their head. And the sprinkling thing really only came into question later when the faith moved into North countries where there was less water and more ice, and you could potentially endanger the person by like submersing them in ice water or something, right?
Right.
So that's not the big question. The question is like, what does this bath do? That's the question. Like, what does this bath do? What does it mean? What does it mean for the person being bathed? What does it mean for the people bathing them and witnessing to it? What does it do for the person being bathed, and what does it do to or for the community witnessing to and assisting in it?
Well, and again, the other piece of the conversation is just, again, understanding it's a baptism for you, it's a dedication for me, but you're still doing the same. So again, it's not, we do things different. The ritual, we'll say, is different, but the underlying meaning is pretty much the same.
Right. So infant baptism and infant dedication in those Protestant communities that don't practice baptism but that do dedications instead are pointing to many of the same realities, right?
Right.
They recognize the authenticity of the faith of the parents of the baby, and that the parents want to give the baby the best gift that they have, which is their faith. And this ritual articulates that to the best of the knowledge or ability of the people that are involved, right?
Right.
So you're trying to give your kid the best you got is what's happening.
And it's not that when it comes to growing up, the evangelical or however you're going to label the non-Catholic, but because baptism still plays a role, just not at that given time for me.
Right. The issue is The issue is that for Catholics and for Orthodox Christians and for some of these more traditional type Protestants, it's the baptism is itself. It's gonna do something, and that's really sort of what's at the heart of the question of sacrament. For us, the sacraments run. There's kind of technical language here, but I think it's helpful. So the sacraments work ex opere operato. So what that means is the sacraments work by the work being done itself. Like there's a thing that happens simply by the performing of the ritual or the act.
with the intention to do it. Like, so this wouldn't happen if you were playing or if in seminaries when you're practicing or something like that, right? So
Sure.
like when I taught at the seminary, we would practice baptisms with a Cabbage Patch doll. No Cabbage Patch doll was ever actually baptized, right?
Right.
But when you do the thing with the intention that the church intends, that something actually happens. With the dedication piece in those communities that adopted that model, it's not that nothing happens. Something definitely happens, but because their understanding of how sin and sort of development works and what baptism and specifically believers' baptism really means, it can't mean the same thing that Catholics and sort of classical Christians are going to think it means, because it wouldn't be possible for a baby to do that. Whereas for us, it's possible not because of anything the baby does, but because of something Christ does.
Right.
And so we do think a very different thing kind of happens. But in terms of the life of the child, it's very often the same kind of experience. I'm raised in a church-going family. We go to church, mass service, whatever, every Sunday or most Sundays. I learn right from wrong. When I do things bad, once I'm old enough to know what that means, I'm supposed to say I'm sorry. Like there's a lot that really is built in that's very, very similar. We just think that the starting point begins very different.
Which is the perfect segue into the next one, which is confirmation, which again comes in two different ways. So again, baptism still comes in for me, but it just came later. So I was dedicated when I was born.
Right.
Then, and of course, my family, one side of my family was Methodist, the other side of my family was Lutheran. So I'm very familiar with confirmation, which comes a little later. But for me, so we'll start with how it started and how I was raised, and then we can get into the actual confirmation explanation. So for me, it started at the dedication. You're being dedicated to God. God, this is your child. You know, we are all children of God. I am going to raise them, in as a God-fearing child. So then I move on and I get to what we've all heard about, the age of accountability, which that age of accountability is when I know the difference between right and wrong. I know when I did something bad and I know I need to say I'm sorry, or I realize that I've done something wrong. So at that point, when you reach that age of accountability, so for us, it's our time to now the word dedicate comes in, because now I'm going to dedicate my life to Jesus Christ. I'm going to ask Jesus into my heart. By doing that, of course, he comes in to wash away my sins, and then I'm going to now try and live my best life. But I am doing this on, for lack of a better way of saying it, on my terms. I admitted to what I am going to do. I have made that commitment to him, which then from there now is when baptism comes in for me. Because once I have accepted Jesus, now it is that public baptism to say, which you had mentioned earlier about washing the sins and, the ritual of here's what happens. The old man dies, the new, comes
to life.
Right. Comes to life when you're submerged and coming out of the water. So that happens for me around that 7, 8 years old.
7, 8, 9, that kind of when kids are beginning to get their own sense. Yep.
Right. So that's, again, growing up Pentecostal charismatic is how I learned and how it worked for me. But now you have the confirmation, which you were starting to kind of get into the details on that a little bit too, because that's like the formation classes where you're being taught right and wrong. You're being taught as it's leading you to your next sacrament of confirmation.
So when I said at the very beginning that these sacraments are paired or connected to each other in a specific way, baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist or communion are tied together in a very primitive, and I mean that in the like historical sense, and kind of practical way. So in the early church, the practice, at least as far as anybody can tell, and even scholars from those communities that don't practice infant baptism sort of acknowledge this is a thing, right?
Sure.
Is that
is that babies were babies, adolescents, grown-ups that were baptized were baptized, confirmed, or they would probably say chrismated, anointed, and communicated all at the same time. So if you were to go to any Orthodox church in the country or in the world, and you were to be there for a baptism, the baby would be baptized, confirmed, and given a little drop of the consecrated wine all at the same time. So they receive all three sacraments all at once. Eastern Catholics do the same thing. And in many places, the order, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, has been retained. The situation that most Catholics in this part of the world know today, which is where you're baptized within the first few weeks after birth, you receive First Holy Communion at around that age of reason, or age of what did you call it? Age of
accountability.
Age of accountability.
Age of reason, right?
Which is the same thing, right? But you'd receive First Holy Communion at around that time, and then confirmation a bit later. That's entirely an accident of history. And there's a strong movement in the Catholic Church to get that fixed, and several bishops have already adjusted it, because the confirmation piece, what happened was, it's a good kind of window into church history and how things can go very wrong. So theologians typically are only able, this is Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, whatever, right? They're only able to reflect on that which they know or are able to read about. So by the time Martin Luther comes along in the 1520s and 30s, all he knows is what Western Christians are doing in Europe in the middle of the 1500s, right?
Sure.
So what he sees is that babies are baptized shortly after birth. Confirmation takes place at some point later, and that can vary anywhere from about 6 months of age to about 15. And then,
but what's the most common? Because at least from what I knew, even from growing up and knowing people that were confirmed, that was almost like it happened about that time of going into, say, junior, becoming a
junior high or high
teenager.
school.
Yeah,
Right.
So it was like that 12, 13-year-old, your age.
That's really, and I don't mean this in a pejorative or an insulting sense. It's just descriptive, right?
Sure.
This is really a kind of a Protestant practice that Catholics adopted later, and I think for the sake of clarity, it probably wasn't a great idea because it confuses what the different groups thinks are happening.
Sure. Well, and again, this is why I said it's asking the questions and actually sitting down like what we're doing right now and going, look, here's what it is. Here's how we were raised. Here's how I believe. And again, it's not saying that we do not agree or believe the same thing to an extent. It's just in a different way, because as you were saying, the whole baptism, communion,
I'm
and
not
Eucharist,
trying to like.
No, and you're not at all. I'm just, just kind of clarifying for those listening that, again, like for me, really, if you think about, because like I said, I talked about the dedication, and that happened when you're a baby. Now you become saved or born again at that age of accountability. You ask Jesus into your heart, which at that point for me, that would be like my confirmation, you could say.
That's right.
Which at the same time, I am then, because you made the comment how the three things happen together. So then I was also baptized to give my public display of what I have done, my public decision. But then also that's about the time I would start taking communion.
So what happens for us in the Catholic Church, and specifically in the West? So I'm going to say from like Italy west. So sure. Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, England, the whole kit, right?
America.
The issue
America.
was that America.
Yes.
The issue was that the confirmation was reserved to the bishop. And this didn't have anything to do with the sacrament. It had everything. Well, I shouldn't say that. It did not, at least mostly, have anything to do with the bishop.
Sure.
It had, or with the sacrament, it had everything to do with the bishop. So you have these problems where the church was getting so large that bishops were in charge of parishes they never visited. And by insisting that the bishop got to every parish every couple of years to administer confirmation, you held him accountable to visit all of his people.
Right.
So, for instance, when I was in doctoral studies, I knew a guy who found St. Francis of Assisi's name in the baptismal register in the church. In Assisi.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And so this is like 1170 or 71, something like that,
Sure.
right? So the custom in Italy in the 1170s, and I can't say for the whole of Western Europe or anything like that, but the custom in Italy in the 1170s was that the baby would be baptized either that first Sunday after birth, or maybe if the baby was born on Saturday, then maybe the second Sunday, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that all the babies that were born in the last year would be taken to the cathedral on Pentecost, the Feast of the Holy Spirit, and be confirmed on Sunday. So babies were still being confirmed, but they were being confirmed by the bishop, not by the local priest.
Sure.
So it forced the bishop to sort of encounter everybody in his diocese, but it didn't require that they become much older. In different places, that extended further out. And what really confused things for the Catholics was in the early 1900s, St. Pius X, whom St. Pius Church here in Des Moines is named for, he was deeply distressed by the fact that people might be going till they were 16 or 18 without receiving Holy Communion, because you couldn't receive communion until you were confirmed. So he switched the order and said, priests can go ahead and admit children or people to communion as soon as they can tell the difference between this and ordinary bread. So once they recognize there's something special happening to the bread at church,
sure,
but the confirmation might have to wait until the bishop is able to get out there. Now, the irony is today, I routinely confirm people in a way that most Catholic priests for a lot of history would never have been permitted to. So every time I receive someone into the church, every time I receive a Protestant into the church, I confirm them. And in the last year, because of COVID, I confirmed all of our teenagers too that were on schedule. But the teenager thing really comes much later. That's a fruit of reflecting on practice rather than on history or theology. And that's where, if we're having this conversation about sacraments in general, I think it's really important to not only look at what's happening now, which might be the fruit of all kinds of very particular circumstances, but to look at history and say, oh, well, this is what the church meant by this. So a good example, when I was in graduate studies for this stuff, one of the things they talked about was in parts of Russia, it was very common for a long time to communicate, that is, give Holy Communion or give the consecrated host to dead people. Now,
so my next question is, how does that work?
Not well is the answer, right? So this is clearly forbidden. Right. And from the earliest days, it's been forbidden to give sacraments to dead people because they're dead, right?
Do you open their mouth and do you then work it like a puppet? No, sorry. Anyway.
Well, no, you do. No, you're exactly right, Jimmy. So in the places where this was common, what they would do is they would put the host, which by this point is a round circle, right?
Okay.
Into the mouth of the corpse, and it was a memory of when coins would be put in the mouths of the dead to give to Charon to carry them across the river Styx. Sure. The problem was we didn't believe in any of that. Like it was an accident that the host was round and the coin was round. The host could be square or a broken off piece of bread in any shape, right?
Right.
But because it resonated in memory with people, they kept doing it. Well, the problem is what we do, this is 100% a part of the Catholic tradition, is that what we call viaticum, or food for the journey, like Lemnis in the Lord of the Rings, is one's last communion. So we make a big deal about first Holy Communion when a child or an adult receives communion for the first time. Sure. We also make a big deal about last communion with the idea that this is the last time you're tangibly, corporeally connected to Christ through the sacraments before meeting him face to face.
Sure.
But the things got like confused or mixed up together. And so it resulted in an abuse. The problem is, like, if you wrote a doctoral dissertation based on your experience of, well, grandma received communion after she was dead, and grandpa did too, and my mom and my dad, this is all I know, you're going to wind up with a real distorted understanding of what the church, Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox, has ever really thought about the sacrament of communion.
Right. Which, I mean, I get, and we're having the whole Eucharist or communion conversation from confirmation.
Sure.
Let's just go right into that one. So now this is, and I think this is really I don't know that I want to say disconnect, but I can't think of the better word to use for this between the Catholic, the Protestant, the evangelical on the belief in this, because again, it's how you were raised or how you believe. And I know even when it comes to Catholics, not all Catholics kind of
raised the same.
Well, not raised the same, or are not able to kind of wrap their mind around the whole thing either, of what the belief is, or, how it all comes to say. But so for Catholics, you call it, when you have your communion, the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. I grew up and it was communion. And so the definition for me is it was communion because it was my time for my personal communion, with God, to have a conversation with God. It's like, it's kind of like you hear a lot of people talking about your prayer closet. Well, you're not in a closet, you're, in a sanctuary of other people, but you take your sacrament, you take your of course, for me, there wasn't wine, it was grape juice, but you take your wafer or your piece of bread and your grape juice. And then once you then take the communion, you're now to basically be quiet and focus and just have that one-on-one communication with God.
So the experience
that was my experience. That's, for me, that's what it means to me. So it's very personal. It means very much something to me. Though I've been told that I'm wrong and it can't mean anything, which, this is where the thing is, have the conversation. Don't just assume.
Right.
Because now on the Catholic side, it's a completely different conversation.
Let me first of all say, Jimmy, because I think this is important.
No, absolutely.
Not primarily for you, but I mean, also for you, but primarily for those listening who have had the same kind of experience. I would never want in any way to diminish the experience of Christ that my Protestant brothers and sisters have had in their experience of Holy Communion. It's true that we understand what happens differently, and I'm not going to hedge on that. We do think different things are happening, but that doesn't mean that the experience which you have had in Holy Communion is any less or unmeaningful or anything like that. And I certainly wouldn't say, by the fact of you having had the experience, that you're less somehow, right?
Right.
And so I'm sorry that if, and I think you have, but if you've experienced that, or if anybody listening has experienced that with Catholics, I'm sorry, that shouldn't happen. The thing for us, it's true, the accents, you might say, is not so much on the personal. There is obviously a very personal thing that happens because you're taking a thing into your body, and that thing you take into your body is meant to facilitate a personal encounter with Christ, which has to kind of leave a mark, as it were, right?
Absolutely.
But it's not for us, precisely because the experience happens in common with other people. There's a communal dimension every time we receive communion, even if we're by ourselves. So I take communion to the sick, right? And the communion that I take to the sick comes, I don't re-celebrate the Eucharist or reconsecrate the host when I'm there. I bring Holy Communion from the celebration of the Eucharist that we had on Sunday to the people that I visit during the week. And that, at least in principle, ties them to the community's experience of Eucharist on Sunday. Even if their only experience of that is to see it on TV or YouTube or whatever, or just to know factually that it happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a communal dimension that's a real and important part of this for us that is not necessarily of all other communities. What most Catholics tend to land on with the experience of Eucharist, they'll really press hard the question of real presence.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be very honest. I'm not especially interested in that question. I believe in it 150%. That's
Right.
not the issue. But I'm not especially concerned with how anybody explains it. The thing that really distinguishes the Catholic, and I would also say the Orthodox understanding of Eucharist, is that not the receiving of the consecrated elements, but the celebration itself, the gathering of the community around the table, whereby the person says, "This is my body, this is my blood."
Mm-hmm.
That for us, and for, I'm going to say, Orthodox and kind of historic, classically minded Christians, itself constitutes a share in Christ's sacrifice.
Well,
so the language of sacrifice is what
Mm-hmm.
really distinguishes the Catholic tradition. It's not real presence. There are plenty of Christians that believe in real presence, but that are not very comfortable with the language of sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
But there are not that many Christians that are uncomfortable with the notion of real presence, but who like the language of sacrifice for what happens at the altar.
Right.
And so that's the thing that for us really, and the way you can tell this, right, is that when Catholics talk about who can and can't receive communion, what they'll say is, well, the reason they can't receive is because they don't believe in the real presence. It's not true. Most Lutherans, all Episcopalians, most Presbyterians believe in some version of real presence. They don't think you're just imagining Jesus. They really do think Jesus does something to make himself present, but they explicitly reject the notion of sacrifice, because what they're concerned with, which is entirely understandable, is a kind of medieval, what they understand to be a medieval sense, that we're re-sacrificing Christ every time the community gathers around the altar. Now, the church has never held that, and it was explicitly condemned during the Reformation, but that didn't stop other people from saying it. And
Right.
and this is a shame on my community, but it didn't stop other people from charging money for it. And so,
no, really,
right? Yeah, no. And so this causes real, like, and that
the early
that
on
stuff,
televangelist.
Yeah, no, we were the first ones. We charged money for the little bit of dirt and the little bit of oil and the little bit of Jesus that you got in the consecrated bread. And so what this did, right, was it left a deep sense of scandal
Mm-hmm.
in different communities for several hundred years. And there's no excuse for that. I'm not going to try and offer one because it would be fruitless. I just have to say honestly that those people who did that did not represent the best of our tradition. We've articulated much more clearly what we think is really happening. I do think the language of sacrifice is appropriate for the celebration of the Lord's Supper, but it's got to be understood within the context. And that when it's understood within context, it can make the celebration of the Lord's Supper much more meaningful, even for those who can't receive communion. So almost every week, I have a funeral where I have to say to people, so in the Catholic Church, the sacrament of Holy Communion both means, like symbolizes, and affects communion not only with Christ and the Church. And so for that reason, from our perspective, from the Catholic perspective, only Catholics and Orthodox Christians that are not conscious of grave sin are welcome to receive Holy Communion. That's true. However, everybody needs in this moment to really be thinking about, and of course this is happening primarily at funerals, right? Our communion or connection with the person who has died.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had more people who can't receive communion at the funeral come up to me afterwards and tell me, I've been a lot of Catholic funerals where I couldn't receive communion and I always felt shut out. That's the first time I really felt connected, because the ritual action, it was important. It's not like they all were happy they couldn't receive communion, right? But but they got that there was a different thing happening, and that their connection to it was more profound than the particular action that they took in the course of the ritual. And I think that matters a great deal and can go a long way to healing some of the hurts that we've built with each other around communion or non-communion, because it's not simply about what I can or can't do. That puts all the onus on me. The real question is on what God can and can't do. And that forces all of us, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, to rely on God.
Right. Well, and that's one thing for me when it comes to communion. And we were not one to ever shy away from sacrifice, because the one thing that always was talked about is how Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice, because he died for me.
Us.
He died for us. And again, that personal, it's like, he died for me. And you're doing this, you need to remember that. And it's, again, that conversation of what he did for us. Yeah, I'll be honest, growing up, I was almost waiting some Sundays for the altar to come out and the big old boar or whatever. And anyway, that's a different story. But just start cutting them up. But no, that's very important. And I think then this rolls into that the next one. So the penance. So that's the confessing of the sin, correct?
Right. So for Catholics, this is the order that was listed is not always the order in which things are received, right?
Sure.
So for most Catholics, the practical order of the sacraments goes like this: baptism at or under 6 months of age, confession at or around 6 or 7 years of age, communion at or around 7 or 8 years of age, usually fall and spring. So confession typically happens in the fall and communion in the spring. And then confirmation anywhere from 8 or 9 to 17 or 18. And then if you're going to be married or receive orders, that happens typically in your 20s or 30s. And then unction or anointing typically happens later. Confession, right, is, as you were speaking before, the age of accountability or age of reason. It's what happens once a person realizes in a meaningful way that they have done something wrong for which they need forgiveness. And that can happen. I've had little ones come to me as young as 4 who clearly understood I screwed up and I screwed up big. And I've had people come to me as old as 80 who only at that point really realized, hey, my actions have an effect on other people. I should probably do something about that, right? And most of us are somewhere in between that, obviously. What confession is intended to do is twofold. The fathers of the church, those guys in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, talk about it as the second plank. So it's like, and the image here is like of walking the plank, like for a pirate, right? The plank is meant to give you a bridge to tomorrow, a bridge to salvation. Baptism is the first because it forgives all your sins and is supposed to make you right. But very early on, they realized, hey, turns out people get baptized and still sin. What do we do about that? And because Christ had said before he died, whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, whose sins you retain are retained, the understanding was that the apostles, so for us, those are the bishops and their successors, retain the power to forgive and retain sins. And that what confession does is it best prepares one for the reception of Holy Communion. This often gets cast in terms much like Jewish sort of purification rituals, right? So like you go make yourself ready so that you can receive the fruits of the sacrifice. And there's an element of that that's there, like it would be foolish to deny it, but it's not simply that. Like we're not just like Jews with Jesus. The move here really is that my sins, especially my serious sins, not only separate me or divide me from God, but from everybody else. And so I need not only God in my private prayer, but someone representing the community to absolve me or forgive me and restore me to life in the community. And so in the early church, this was often done publicly. So if you had screwed up big, not like I was mean to my brother or I said a naughty word or something like that, right?
Sure.
But like I slept with somebody's wife, or I offered incense to the emperor or something like that, then you would be permitted to confess publicly, and then a penance, or what I typically say, like a homework assignment, would be given you.
Mm-hmm.
But the penances in the early church were severe. They were hardcore. You would be put on bread and water for a year or two.
Right.
And so then you couldn't be admitted to communion, that is holy, the sacrament of communion.
Sure.
Until after you had completed your penance, which was a kind of sign of good faith on your part that, like, I'm going to do better this time. The reason that matters is because today, the penances we give are typically pretty minimal. Pray some or do a good work or whatever, that kind of thing. But the idea is exactly the same. You need to prepare yourself before you go to receive this great gift. And so while we encourage people to confess as often as they can before receiving Holy Communion, we insist on it, like before marriage and before being ordained, and especially at the end of life, before death. Like that somebody talk to somebody and really try and put away whatever has gotten in the way over the course of the last several years, right?
Sure.
So that you can be as committed and present to as you possibly can.
Right. So that brings us to the next one. I mean, and again, as we're going through all these, so for me, the confession, that kind of falls back to where I was having the earlier conversation of the confirmation, or that age of accountability when I asked
Right.
Jesus into my heart. I mean, I guess the biggest difference for depending on what you grew up in is I'm not going to a priest to do it. I just go straight to God.
Right.
I confess it. I confess that to him daily. Here's what I did. God, please forgive me. I mean, and this is a conversation that would be a lot deeper of, right, wrong. I mean, so again, we're believing, it's just in a different, I guess I don't want to use ritual on this, but we do it in different ways. Is that,
that's
would
right?
that be a good way of saying that?
No. I think what the ritual does is it expresses different understandings of what's happening.
Sure.
So the fundamental thing, right, is that Catholics and Orthodox Christians insist on the language of priests to talk about their ministers in a way that most, not all, but most Protestants are very uncomfortable with. Mm-hmm. Because we genuinely see our priests as sort of inheritors of the historic priesthood of the temple, which means that our primary job is to forgive sins and make sacrifice.
Right.
But that the sacrifice that we offer, the forgiveness of sins, is not in some ways a lot different, except we no longer slaughter livestock to do it.
Right. Yeah, you don't have the altar sitting up front with the ram there
with a bull or exactly.
Right. Like I said, then that was one of the things I was always waiting for growing up, that they would pull the ram out and slit his throat, and I'm like,
it never happened.
Yeah, I was disappointed. I was like, come on, wait a minute, I need some blood here, but
blood and guts.
Yeah, I know. I was a weird child. I'm a weird adult. I mean, it just kind of happens that way.
You're not that weird of a child, but the Catholic and Orthodox understanding of priesthood really is that what priesthood does is it establishes someone in the community whose purpose in the community is to forgive sins and offer sacrifice.
Right.
And he's set aside or set apart in the community for this purpose. In the West, that happens with celibacy. In the East, it happens primarily with sacrifice. And so a big difference between the East and the West on this score is that in the West, very early on, the first 3 or 4 centuries, Mass or Eucharist began to be celebrated daily. In the East, much as in Protestant communities, it's typically only celebrated on Sundays and or what we would think of as like major feasts, special days like Christmas or Easter or that kind of thing, right?
I mean, for me growing up, we did communion once a month. It was like the first Sunday of the month.
Right.
I don't know why. That's just the way it worked.
Well, that tradition, and this is not a slight or a critique, it's just honest, right?
Right.
That tradition came out of post-Reformation traditions who were trying to accent the importance of the action of the believer and especially study of scripture kind of over and against the celebration of sacraments. Not that you did away with celebration of sacrament, but that it wasn't as frequent, and that way you didn't get kind of we'll say hooked on it in the same way. And they
kind of make it, you could almost say that almost makes it a little more reverent because it happened.
Familiarity breeds contempt, right? So if you do something too often, the temptation is to take it not seriously enough.
Right.
And so those Protestant communities that have retained infrequent communion, ironically, oftentimes have more reverent communions than those of us who do it every day. I don't think there's a serious doubt about that. But the question is what you think this is or does. And we clearly do have different understandings of what this is or does, because those communities that rejected the notion of sacrifice were very concerned that you created a kind of priestly caste, me, who are able to do things that other people can't do, you, that make me better than you. And the thing is, like, I don't actually think I'm better than you or can do, I'm putting this in snare quotes that you can't see, right? But,
well, yeah, at least during this podcast, you don't think that you're better than me. But outside of this,
well, maybe, but no, but like the move really here is like, no, absolutely, it's not about a caste system in the church. It's simply about recognizing different relationships between different people.
Sure,
I marry all kinds of people. I don't expect to be able to sleep with their wives. That's a thing that belongs to the husband, right?
Right.
He's not in a special caste because he gets to sleep with his wife. That's just their job, right? That's their mission together is to be intimate in that way. My job is to not be intimate in that way so that I can be present to and aware for other things. Now you can have very reasonable arguments whether that's a good idea or not. That's a different kind of question, right? But in the same way that, like, we don't have just anybody come up and celebrate communion on Sunday, you don't just have anybody come over and sleep with your wife on Wednesday, right? Like it's a different thing,
right?
And it means different things. And I recognize that using that language might be offensive or striking.
I am offended, and I cannot believe you done this.
But what I think is important about this is that, like, the offense that somebody would feel at the notion that you would think the ability to sleep with their wife is probably the closest that Catholics or Orthodox Christians come to how they would feel to having somebody else celebrate communion for them.
Sure.
Like the priest occupies that kind of a role in the community. That's his job. He's married to the church. His job is to do this thing and not that other thing. To such an extent, right, that married clergy, both in the Catholic and Orthodox churches, refrain from sex with their wives the night before they celebrate Eucharist. Much like the Jewish priests did, to sort of say, no, this thing that I'm doing tomorrow, that's really dedicated. Like, I'm not going to be distracted by body things then. There's a fair question whether that's a good idea, but the move is right, that we're trying to put something all the way over.
Sure.
For him.
Absolutely. And I think the first, I mean, when it comes to the 7 sacraments, the first 4 that we hit are probably and I'm sure each one of those probably could have been a podcast just on its own.
Yeah.
Because they're very
too
deep.
Long.
No, and you're fine. I mean, again, it's a deep conversation, but again, the bottom line when we come to this is there's nothing out of the four, out of us looking at it or doing it in a different manner or form, that I disagreed with. I mean, I agreed with every single one of that. So for a person to tell me that, well, you don't believe in them, well, again, you're wrong. It's asking, right. It's asking the right questions. Don't just assume, because we know what happens when you assume. So the next one is the anointing of the sick, which I totally believe in this. And again, growing up Pentecostal charismatic, I mean, speaking of you're talking about having, the Eucharist or communion every day, or, however that, a very common thing.
Right.
It was nothing for us that after every service, every Sunday, well, it didn't matter if it was Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, we had basically
somebody was
healing
anointed.
Service. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you come down front now and we are going to pray with you, whatever that ailment is, or, of course, and we all are very common with this. If you've been at a hospital of, a priest or a pastor coming in and praying for the person at the hospital. So, I mean, really, what is the difference? But so for you, because you actually have a healing service the first Friday of every month.
Right. So here at Christ the King, we have a very kind of dedicated ministry to the sick. And so we do something every month on the first Friday. Other places have it organized slightly differently. And the date and the time is not especially important. Like that would really just be reflective, frankly, of like the priest's schedule or something like that. Right. But the move that we pray for and make ourselves present to the sick, the bereaved, the otherwise injured, that kind of situation, right? That is just typical of the Christian tradition in almost every form, sort of across the board, right? Like we tends to those that are hurting.
Right.
And for us, what we think of as the sacrament of anointing, or that older name that you used when you were initially rattling stuff off, of unction, which is an old-timey English word for anointing. Mm-hmm. It's called extreme unction or last unction on the idea that there was a first or original unction. And that first or original unction is, for us, confirmation.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that in the early church, people were anointed, that is, rubbed down with oil, like lotion today, at baptism / confirmation, which always happens simultaneously. So the confirmation was just the rubbing down part of the baptism. And they were typically rubbed down. This may shock some listeners. We're not trying to scandalize anybody. It's just very honest. Baptisms in the early church were most typically done in the nude. And so they were done in single-sex communities. So you would have some kind of a barrier between the men and the women. And you would have a woman on the women's side and a man on the man's side doing the physical baptism. And then they would be rubbed down with oil. And this oil would cover the whole body. So you very specifically the senses. So the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the nose, the hands, and the feet. And in some places, and this is not meant to creep people out or freak them out, but it's just part of our history, the groin. And the reason for that was because the idea was you wanted to sanctify or make holy all of those places where we do the most important things. And so now there was always other people around, so you wouldn't just have somebody fiddling with somebody else's bits, right? That was not the idea.
Right.
But in order to ensure propriety, you would make sure that women were the ones rubbing oil on women, and men were the people rubbing oil on men.
Sure.
This was, of course, a heteronormative world and all the things, right? But
right.
But the idea here, right, is that the anointings were done at the beginning to set aside or set apart for sort of for mission, much as, right, David is anointed by Saul to mark him off as the king.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, the anointings are done for healing, much like lotion is used today, right? So you rub lotion on dry skin, you rub lotion on sores, you put icy hot on your muscles when they hurt, right?
Right.
And the idea there is that the lotion is coming for healing. The third use, which we do still use today, though people notice it less and it's less obvious, is before a person is baptized, whether it's an infant or a grown-up, they're anointed. If it's a baby, it's on their chest. We don't anoint grown-ups on their chest anymore because we don't want to get sued.
Right.
But the idea is a memory of rubbing athletes down with oil.
Mm-hmm.
So athletes still rub themselves down with oil to look tough and strong. In the old days, the idea was that you would make yourself slippery so that your enemy couldn't hold on to you. And the idea is, the prayer that said when you do this is an exorcism. You want to make the child or the grown-up slippery so the devil can't hold on to them.
I thought it was just the icy hot, so it would like make the pain go away. That's why they are rubbing.
What was your experience of anointing growing up? How was oil used, Jimmy?
So, well, I mean, and again, oil was a very common thing. I mean, and usually when it came to the anointing of oil, it was always whenever, they were being prayed, when you were being prayed for. So when we were going down to be prayed for, whatever that is, either being sick or just, needing prayer for something, during that prayer service, I guess you could say at the end of it, they'd anoint, and it was always anointing your head. Not much different, I guess, when you'll be having Ash Wednesday coming up soon, where they do the ashes and the cross on your forehead. It was the same for us of using the oil and in the sign of a cross on your forehead. When they're praying and then laying their hands on you, because for me a lot of that was the whole laying on of hands. When they prayed for you, your arm hurt, so they would, touch your arm,
lay
where
hands
it
on,
hurt, and actually put the hands on as they're praying for the healing from God. So I mean, the oil was a very common thing used for different things, even to the point of, I know we were together a few months ago now when you had a person come over and they wanted their car blessed, so it also be used for blessings. I mean, I know my dad drove truck for 30 years, and if he was in town and he was getting ready to go out on, to do a run, he, after church, the semi would be out there, and he would have the pastor come out and basically anoint the truck, for safe travels. So I mean, using the whole oil anointing was a very common practice, very common use, not just for healing, but also for different blessings and even for prayer when you were being prayed for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, again, I think a lot of the ways that we're seeing a lot of similarities, again, maybe in different ways on how it is done, because for us, it wasn't like a full ritual being done. It was just more of like an anointing and a prayer. But again, asking the questions and really learning what that person did, kind of like what you said earlier of not being presumptuous and not assuming, and you're not like me, so you're wrong. Have that conversation, but be respectful and be reverent on what it was that they have when they grew up. Because again, we believe in God. We believe in Jesus Christ. And, it's not like we're in a completely other form of religion that doesn't even bring that into play.
Right.
Look at the commonalities between the two to be able to have those conversations. Where is it that you and I can have a discussion? We might not agree on everything, but what is that underlying piece that, we do agree on this, and we're pretty right on where it comes to here. So, we're not that far apart in the whole scheme of things. So going from the anointing of the sick, now we roll into the last two, which I think now are these kind of a paired thing, depending on, at least with the Catholics, marriage and holy orders. So either you're going to take the sacrament of marriage or you're going to take the sacrament of holy orders, which for you, if I get this right, holy orders for you is priest. You're going to become a priest. Is that kind of how it is? How you guys.
That's a very natural understanding. It's slightly more nuanced than that.
Okay.
So in some ways,
I mean, and it could be like none, it could be whatever it is, but you know what I meant.
No. It's so this is where the distinction comes in.
Okay.
So the sacrament of orders, in some ways it's better called the sacrament of order, by which I mean like direction or organization.
Sure.
So the sacrament of orders, as far as the church understands it today, consists of bishops, so the overseers, the heads of like a regional or diocesan church, right? Priests, which would be more or less equivalent to most Protestant communities' ministers, and then deacons, which may or may not be equivalent to most Protestant communities' versions of deacon, because deacon can mean a different thing in different places, right?
Right.
So bishops, priests, and deacons, it's that threefold ministry. And the reason for that is because it comes to us from the Acts of the Apostles, the epistles of St. Paul, that this is how the church organized itself in the very earliest days. And that you're 100% right in this sense. For the most part, our experience of this is a person is either married or ordained, not typically both at the same time. There are, of course, exceptions where, so like today, I gave an interview to a seminarian, so a guy studying for priesthood, who is a widower. So he was married for 25 years, and then after his wife died, decided to go back to pursue orders. So that's he assuming he's ordained,
sure,
would have been married first, and then after his wife died, gone back. The other version of this is, in the last 40 years or so, the permanent or perpetual deacons, like Deacon Tony, whom you work with,
sure,
is presently married, but then later, usually significantly later after the marriage, is then ordained. Nuns or monks, religious brothers,
sure,
the word order is used for the group they belong to, but not to what they do. That's not holy orders in the same sense. And the reason is they kind of operate based on what we would call kind of a gentleman's agreement around their life together. Whereas the bishop, the priest, and the deacon, from our perspective, are permanently associated to the church in this particular way. And the only way to sort of get out of it is for the church to permanently disassociate you in that way.
Gotcha. So for you, when it comes,
that makes sense.
No, it does. So, and I guess we kind of skipped over a marriage a little bit, but not too much, because marriage is marriage. I mean, right. So the sacrament of marriage is marriage. I mean, there's not really a lot of definition with that. I mean, Lutheran, Methodist, Pentecostal, Assembly of God, put the name on here. Marriage is marriage. So, I mean, that one is, everyone pretty much understands that one. And so going straight to the holy order one. So for you, the holy order then really comes down to the bishop, priest, and deacon. So it's taking that vow of to work for the church in that way. And for me, the belief that I have and the way I was raised, to me, we all have orders, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so for me, the holy order is, that calling that you have. The calling could be that I could have became a youth pastor. I could have became a pastor. If I could sing, a worship pastor. Or, the calling could be, God is wanting to use you in a different form, in a different way. I mean, so for me, being in radio for over 30 years, that was a calling that I didn't really know that I had, and kind of fell into it. And here I am still doing it so many years later. But to me, so for me, the belief, or how that comes to me, that my calling is my order. This is what God is wanting me to do.
So these are
so a little. So still very important to a person depending on what they're doing, but just on how it's viewed differently on how you apply it. Is that a right way of saying that?
Yeah. No, you're hitting on something that's really important, and that I think, in some ways, this might be the most important thing for our people to hear. Right?
Okay.
Is that the notion of order, or calling, and vocation are deeply tied together. So So in the early church, for the first 4 centuries at least, Christian spouses, so husbands and wives, were actually known as the Ordo Sponsi, or the Order of Spouses. So the idea was that simply being a Christian husband or wife put you in a kind of separate category than somebody else.
Okay.
That part is patristic, so those first century and a half or two after the Bible's done.
Mm-hmm.
But even within the Bible, right, even with St. Paul, we have the order of widows and the order of virgins. And they're like separate categories of Christians that exist in particular ways. The widows, because their husbands are dead, are able to give themselves wholly in life to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
The virgins, at least some of them, choose never to marry for more or less the same reason, right?
Right.
Now, that's not because everybody's meant to be a virgin or everybody's meant to be a widow or a widower, but that because based on where you're at in life right now, God will call you to some things and not to other things.
Right.
And in that, we're absolutely the same. The thing that would be different for us is that we really understand, and this is deeply embedded in Catholic life and psyche and culture and ritual, that a deacon or a priest or a bishop, something happens when he's ordained that doesn't simply give him like permission to function within the community in a particular way,
right,
but empowers him to do so. And even should he fail like desperately in his ministry, that mark, or we call it a character, it stays with him forever, so that a bad priest is damned as a priest, which is worse than being damned as a layman, because he had more available to him than the other guy did.
Right. You're being held to a higher standard. Right, a higher standard or a stronger accountability, because
That's right.
I mean, what else?
And you had every chance, and you failed in it.
Right.
So for us, it's permanent. But the idea is the same in that it orders or organizes us in the church in a particular way. Right. The other thing that is just worth saying, because it can't necessarily be taken for granted now, is that the Catholic presumption for marriage genuinely is that it's permanent.
Right. Which is, I mean, really that the assumption, as you said, I mean, that's really what it's supposed to be. I mean, you read scripture and it's to be permanent. I mean, there is no divorce. I mean, we go back and, the conversations when you read with Moses and all that, and it's like, even with the conversation with Jesus, when they talked about, you say this, but then,
he gave you this out of the hardness of your heart.
Right. You give us permission to write these papers of the divorce to give to them. And which goes back to Moses, is like, that's because you were, for lack of a better way of, this is the Jimmy version of this. Basically, you were kicking and screaming and whining. This is what you wanted. You wouldn't shut up unless I gave it to you. So we said, fine, here you go. I gave you enough rope to hang yourself.
Right.
That's the layman version,
Nope. You've nailed it.
So, which, I mean, goes back to the thing of, you always hear everybody saying, God's got this, God's going to do this, which, I agree with that 150%. Yeah. But God also, if you read through the stories of the Bible, that God's still going to just give you the rope and say, look, that's what you want. That's what you're going to get. I mean, an example, which I think I've even shared with you lately, that I've been using a lot with a lot of my friends with things that are happening in the world right now, and going, well, God's not through with this. God's not through with this. I'm like, really? God's not through with this? I remember this particular time with the Israelites, and God said, here, you are now in the land that I promised you. You are in the promised land. And you know what? You can govern yourself. You do not need to be ruled by a king. And they kicked and screamed and threw a fit and said, no, we have to have a king. He's like, fine, here you go. And if I remember right, which, I mean, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's when he gave them King Saul, which
That's correct.
they would have been better off staying in Egypt.
Right.
And the way they were being actually treated better as slaves in Egypt than how Saul treated them. So yes, God is in control. God is there. I mean, again, you hear the conversation of, even when Jesus was going through going through the crucifixion, and we talk about bringing the Eucharist back into this, but he's going through to die, to be that ultimate sacrifice. And he says, and even when he was going through the temptation, saying, yes, I could call angels down right now, a multitude of angels to save me, but that's not God's plan.
That's right.
In front of Pilate, yes, I could call them down to say, well, when he's on the cross, yes, you call them down to save you. He could, but that wasn't the plan. That was not God's plan. So yeah, he's there, but we're going to sit here and kick our feet and moan and groan. Guess what? He'll give you enough rope to hang yourself.
That's correct. Every time.
I mean, it just kind of is what it is. But so that was a very long definition of, we probably should have done 7 different ones.
We probably should have. We should have planned this different, Jimmy. I apologize.
It's not your fault. It was probably mine too. And but again, and again, when this is all said and done, when we started this, the whole conversation is to, again, be able to have a conversation with someone. It doesn't matter if you believe are the same or not. Be willing to sit down and have a cup of coffee and understand where that person is coming from, and not assume, presume, judge, anything like that. Just because this is the way that was how you were raised or grown or believe, does not mean the other person you're talking to doesn't believe wholeheartedly the same in how they were grown. Because you shouldn't, you and I will have conversations, and we've had many. I diminish nothing that you've ever said to me of what you believe.
And dittos. I think we'd say, right?
Right. And you've given me the same respect back. Because again, we've looked for that common ground, those common pieces that here's where we're agreeing. All right, now how can we come together and let's move forward and conquer what we're trying to accomplish, rather than bicker at each other.
I'm with you, brother.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. Otherwise, I don't know where we are. Anyway, I've been chatting with Father PJ McManus. PJ, thank you very much for your time. Again, he is a co-host for the show Be Not Afraid, which you can hear on Iowa Catholic Radio. You can also pretty much hear it on many podcast platforms where you listen to many of your favorite podcasts. Check that out. And he is also the pastor of Christ the King Church in Des Moines. Father PJ, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. And hopefully your food isn't cold that I know you were making for dinner.
Soon and very soon. Thank you, Jimmy.
All right, brother. We will talk to you soon. Thank you very much. You have been listening to the Daily Planet. I'm Jimmy Olson, your host. And you can, if you liked and enjoyed this podcast, please share it with others. You can do that on social media. You can also follow me on social media, both Facebook and Twitter at My Buddy Jimmy, and then on YouTube at My Buddy Jimmy 101.
The Jimmy Olson Radio Network.